I'm David Tobie. I'm Global Product Technology Manager at Datacolor, and I will be presenting today with David Saffir on the other side of the continent in California. David is a professional photographer specializing in commercial photography and landscape photography, and he is joining us for what should be an interesting webinar. Now today Datacolor has a co-sponsor, which is Digital Silver Imaging, and we're looking forward to including them in a few of our comments, since David and I are both big fans of actual silver prints for certain types of work and large format prints of many kinds for many kinds of our work. So I'm sure that will sneak into the discussion as we go along. So first, let me say hi to David Saffir. Are you out there, David?
I am. Hello, David. Good morning.
Good morning.
Actually, it's afternoon now.
Well, it is for me. Is it for you? I guess it's 1 minute afternoon for you. I always work on the if I haven't had my lunch yet, it's still morning theory.
There you go.
So I'm going to let you start in and give an overview here, David, along with this very impressive photograph, and we can take it from there.
Well, hi everybody. I'm David Saffir. I'm a photographer. I live on the left coast in California, just outside of Los Angeles. I'm a commercial and fine art photographer. I'm also a printmaker, and I'm pretty heavily involved in color management because of the printmaking. And today we're going to be talking about exploring photographic composition in landscape and still life, and really what we're going to do is talk about how people achieve their artistic vision, or not, and what elements in each photograph contribute to that, and how intent plays a role, and things that are similar to that. And not necessarily dissect things down to the finest detail, but really try to define and clarify the key concepts that are involved in making a good photographic composition. I do want to mention that this is sponsored by Datacolor. Datacolor is a company that very many of you know. I can see that a lot of people that are online right now have attended previous webinars. And of course, Datacolor is one of the premier color management companies in the world. From the standpoint of photographers, of course, just a couple of examples of what they do include display calibration and printer calibration and those sorts of things. And we also have a sponsor named Digital Silver Imaging, which is a fine art digital photographic lab. And just a couple of words about how I got to know them. I was working on a project about a year ago in relation to large format digital negatives and printing on silver halide paper in the darkroom. And I started that project with them, ended very successfully with an exhibition in New York at the ProPhoto Expo. They print true black and white silver gelatin prints directly from your digital files. They use a Durst photographic digital enlarger. And they also print archival fine art inkjet prints with Epson wide format printers and HDR inks. And of course they have a variety of custom mounting and framing solutions. So I encourage you to visit them at digitalsilverimaging.com, and of course Datacolor's website is datacolor.com. So let's get started. The first image here is of the Snake River. Of course it's one that we're all familiar with. It's by Ansel Adams. This image is licensed under Creative Commons, so we don't have any problems there. And we're going to move on to some of the other images and come back to this one in a later discussion, but I thought it was a great way to get off on the right foot, so to speak. I really love this particular photograph. So let's see, I've got to get this to move to the next page. And in exploring composition, there's a number of things that we should consider. We should be thinking about balance, and that's the balance of the elements, but also luminosity, light and shadow. We're looking at depth of field, what I sometimes call depth of focus, whether the nearer or farther away elements are apparently sharp or not. Leading lines in the photograph, leading lines that lead your eye to another element in the photograph. The rule of thirds, which is something that just about every photographer has heard of. And the rule of thirds can really serve you well in putting your compositions together. The use of movement can be very important. The perception of depth in an image. There are some images that benefit greatly by having a very narrow plane of focus, and there are other images that benefit greatly from creating the perception of three-dimensionality and of depth from foreground to middle ground to background. And in the end, one composes the whole and tries to direct the viewer in a way that's meaningful to both the photographer and the viewer. David, I think this is your photograph. Do you want to say a few words about this?
Well, this is a classic composition having a, in fact, we will see, keep your eyes open, later in this same presentation there's another image that has no people in it, and yet the composition, light out of dark, areas of detail in the center with a dark surround. There's another image that has that exact same composition while having totally different content. What's interesting to me about this image is that half a second sooner and these people would have been silhouettes. Half a second later and the high contrast on the arms would have been lost. So you can talk about this as a kind of a classical composition with forms in space, but you can also talk about it on a human level. And what makes this image successful on a human level is the gesture and the arms, starting with his elbow and her arm across his back, and then his arm over to her arm, and then up across her shoulder to her hair. That loop is very human and very powerful, and is a great deal of what makes this image satisfying. So along with the gesture of her kind of willowy figure bending way over to the side to put her head on his shoulder as they're walking, those are all very human aspects of this image that to me are far more important than whether there is a trash dumpster in front of them in the image, which in fact there is. If I were working on this as a fine art image in a classical sense, I might be tempted to remove some things, power lines and dumpsters, from it. If I'm looking at it as a romantic image from that point of view, then I'm not sure that those other factors affect me in the same way. But we could spend forever on every image here. So David, I'll let you move on and we can talk about some of the others.
Yeah, I do want to say a few words about some of the elements in this image that I particularly like. I like the use of shadow. There's a lot of people who try to fill in the shadow either using HDR techniques or whatever other methodologies, and there are times where a very deep, dark, non-detailed shadow can really frame the image for you, and I think it succeeds wonderfully in this case. I also particularly like the leading lines. If you look at the wall on the left, down at the bottom and the line at the top, they create a triangle that frames the couple. And I think that's very important because it helps draw the viewer's eye to what's important. I think your eye would go there anyway, but it encapsulates that moment in time. It helps to frame it, if you will. And I think that's an important part of the success of this photograph, including the fact that since they're moved over to the left, that the edges of the wall are unbroken by their silhouettes for the most part. And so there's some very interesting use of lines and shadow and light in this. And again, they're walking into the light, which I think is a very nice metaphor. So this photograph, beyond the human gesture, is technically quite sound and really does direct the viewer. I think that's an important point here. So we'll move to the next and talk a little bit about balance. Balance implies weight, and in fact, if you look at the image before this image, elements which are darker in tone or have low contrast or subdued color move back. In other words, they become less prominent. They tend to draw the eye second to those areas that are more colorful, that have more luminance, and that sort of thing. So first of all, using darker and lighter elements that are fairly well separated in dynamic range certainly adds to the perception of depth in an image, but it also adds weights, if you will. So in this image on the left, we have a very strong weighted area on the left in the shadows. There's almost no detail on the left edge. you know, underneath the signs and on the sidewalk. And yet where the people are walking, there's a particularly bright area, so it draws your eye there, and they're going to be walking into the shadows this time. And the bright area tends to balance the shadow area, even though it's smaller, less prominent, but the two elements together balance the image. The other thing that I think really works here is the creation of artificial lines in here by the man-made elements, the lines in the sidewalk, the lines in the parking lot, the lines in the fence and the signs and things like that. They're at an angle, and so they don't constrict the feeling of movement in the photograph. In fact, they facilitate it. David, you want to say a few things?
Well, some of the images that were chosen for this presentation were chosen because of their complexity rather than because of their presenting one obvious function. And this is certainly one of those images that you could keep analyzing in different ways every day of the week and not quite come to an end of it. There's a lot in here. It's a very sophisticated composition, and it works, and I don't have a one-liner for why. But great image, David.
Okay, thank you. An image I think that most of us will recognize. I think if memory serves, this is Hernandez, New Mexico. Very interesting image. You want to start with this one, David?
Well, there's a number of things about this image that go against what I learned as perhaps the standard ways of composing an image. There's texture everywhere. There's the entire top half has been artificially masked out. There were clouds up there. They're gone. He chose not to include them in this image. The upper part is very dark, and the lighter elements are at the bottom, so that there's a tendency for this image to look like it could flip upside down at any moment. It's not necessarily stable in that way. The moon is not centered, and the arch of the clouds below it are not centered. The larger building here is not centered. There are all sorts of things that don't follow a simple path. The mountains in the background run off to the left, so they're more powerful at the right, whereas the buildings run off the other direction, so that the building at the left is the most powerful. And it's interesting always to see an unadjusted image of this photo. If you print it directly from the plate, there's all sorts of differences in how he dodged and burned the foreground to create that effect, and how he virtually masked the upper sky to create this effect. So again, this image is not simple. It's very complex. It has a lot of texture, a lot of detail. You can't say, you know, these are Lego blocks, block 1, block 2, block 3, that's what makes this picture work. Much more sophisticated, more like what an artist does in painting a complex oil painting.
One of the things I've always liked about this photograph is the use of shadow or darkness up above as a way of, I don't know if I would use the word framing, but it definitely creates a lot of weight at the top of the photograph, and then that's counterbalanced against the luminosity of the village, which is illuminated by the moon. And I think without that dark area up above, I think you would lose a lot of that sense of intimacy side by side with some mystery, because there's no people that you can see moving around. And so that dark area really helps create the ambiance of the town sleeping at night under the moon. And it's from an emotional standpoint, this has always been one of my favorite photographs. Now, this is an image taken in Sedona in Oak Creek by a friend of mine named Rick Russell. And one of the interesting things about this image is that it was taken on a day, it was very overcast, and so shot on 4x5. If I remember correctly, it's shot on Astion and Scan. And it's a little flat in the original scan because of the original lighting. And so what happened was in the process of working through this image in Photoshop, we decided to dodge and burn and basically emphasize some of the shadow areas and bring up some of the lighter areas to help create that feeling of dimensionality that Rick saw when he was standing there with the camera. And I think it succeeded quite well. I saw a print of this the other night that was about 16 by 20, and it's really spectacular. David, I think you had some comments about color and some other issues here.
Yes, this is an interesting image. Living in Maine, I often shoot what I think of as texture shots or macro shots of roadside foliage like this. I roll down the window of my car and shoot these on a regular basis, and many of them work and more of them don't. And it comes down to an issue of why do they work. And in this case, there's something interesting going on where the more dominant forward thrusting colors, the oranges, are actually not in the front of the image. And so what they're doing is they're creating depth and layering and a certain amount of tension by being behind the greens. Similarly, the maple leaves in the foreground are moving towards a more yellow tone, which brings them forward at the same time that the greens move back. So there's some subtlety in here that makes the image dynamic, that doesn't simply follow the the red shirt in the middle of the picture brings it to the foreground and all the green leaves and the rest of the picture move it back, which is the much more typical example of color composition.
And we've all been exposed to the idea of depth of field and depth of focus, and I think most of us know you can choose which elements are in focus and which are not by taking advantage of the aperture settings on your camera. And a low aperture setting, say f2.8, which is what this was shot at, it might have been f4, your plane of focus is very shallow, and so the flowers in the foreground are the main subject of the image, and the flowers in the meadow in the background are really framing the flowers in the foreground. They're providing a backdrop, and so being out of focus is an advantage in this case. And so depth of field, you can use this and set your plane of focus anywhere in the image that you like, really, depending on which camera that you're using. The unsharp areas move back and they're de-emphasized, and the flowers that are within the area of focus are the core of this image. And by the way, this was taken not too far from my house a couple of years ago, and we had a good rainy season. Go ahead, David.
Well, I'm trying to turn my mic off whenever I'm typing because it bothers some people, while on the other hand trying to be interactive, so there's a compromise there. To me, there's an interesting color phenomenon going on here where there are bands of green in this image, and then there are bands of yellower greens in this image, all of which the eye reads as one level or another of greens. And then there's this pink stuff in the foreground that really pops forward, be it pink or purple. But there's more of that further back, and then there's this blue band, which blue is always a questionable color because we tend to read it as sea and sky as well as other things, so that doesn't necessarily come forward the way other floral colors do. So there's really an effect here where there are those colors that jump forward, and they're enhanced by the fact that they're big and they're sharp and they're in the foreground. They're lower in the image. Whereas this blue band at the back is very Pacific in the original meaning of the word. It forms this background line that doesn't try to jump forward on you, and that being totally out of focus and very blue forms a nice background. So I'd never really thought of the riot of colors that you get in an alpine meadow of flowers, that having organized those colors in some pattern was going to strengthen the image, but in this case it clearly does.
I also wanted to mention something that I had forgotten before, is that the camera angle is quite low, and that's something that you should think about in terms of how your composition works. One of the best ways to emphasize these flowers in the foreground was the focal plane, but also to get down on their level and shoot through rather than to shoot down. And I had forgot to mention that before, so it's something to keep in mind when you're dealing with subjects that are relatively small. And now we've got the Snake River. David, do you want to start with this one?
Well, I have actually made several of the comments I would typically make about this image already, since we've started with tough images instead of starting with easy ones. I will mention that we know Ansel Adams from his prints. It's not his scenes, it's not his glass plates, it's his prints. And So, having Digital Silver as a sponsor here makes perfect sense for this webinar, because some of these images are all about silver, and they're all about color management too, in the terms that you've got to be able to get the densities right in order to get those elements down in silver. If you want, for instance, the light shining behind that cloud at the top center, which is incredibly powerful, if you want that to work, you've got to know where your highlights are. You've got to know that you're not blowing things out. And the secondary element in this photo that's equally powerful is the light on the river. It's not this photo with the mountains and the trees and the river that's important here. It's light on forms in space, and it's the way that the clouds happen to have occluded the sun and the way that the light forms that silver shine on the river that makes this photo for me. This could be a very uninteresting image 5 minutes earlier, 5 minutes later, and when you're working with a glass plate camera, 5 minutes is not much time, so you have to really grab your moments when you can. So this image was more about, to me, the mastery of early photo technology to capture these kinds of effects that are so fleeting. I've spent time with great photographers who use wooden cameras, and they might make 10 exposures in a day, and they might see something beautiful, and I might get 100 digital shots of that something beautiful in the time it takes them to try to set up and catch one, and oftentimes they don't catch it, they miss it. So this early technology is very challenging stuff, and that pounded silver effect on this river is something that one might catch more easily today than it was caught back then.
Now, I'll take a different tack on this. Let's talk a little bit about leading lines. If you follow my cursor on the screen, you can certainly see that the river comes through and points to the end of the mountain range. And I think it's no accident that there's a convergence here. And if you look at this, you can see this diagonal line, this diagonal line, these diagonal lines all point here. And in a lot of images that wouldn't really work because it doesn't give the eye any place to go, but you can come back around to the river if you want to, or you can go up and back over the mountain range. And so the image incorporates a lot of energy, even though most of the things that are in the image are not moving, the mountains, the meadows and things like that. I also very much appreciate the use of the masses. The strong ridgeline here balances really nicely against the bend of the land in the river. And so these two things, plus the other side of the river, make up three major masses in the photograph, and they balance each other perfectly. And that really also helps make the photograph and keep the energy in the image. Now, David, this is one of yours. You want us to start here as well?
Well, this is one of mine, and I shot similar compositions here, both with DSLR equipment and with the iPhone. And I believe, depending on where you stole this image, Dave, I believe this is actually the iPhone version. It is, that classic European, even Tuscan image of a European window opened out, so that the window is in the composition as well as the subject matter. I believe that I and the other professional photographer who were staying in this room in this hotel shot 100 frames each easily out through this window, but it was only me that bothered to step back and capture the window as a form to hold the landscape and create this deeper set of layers that this pertains. I'll let you talk about the composition of this, David, since this was your choice for that very reason.
I particularly like this image. I really feel like in a lot of photographs that what I like in photographs is that you have a sense of being there, that you could almost walk into it. And here's the classic looking through a picture window. And one of the most beautiful places on earth, Tuscany. And the windows welcome you to walk up and look out the window and enjoy the view and the scene and the smells and everything else. And so it's a very evocative photograph to me. The pastel sky is very gentle and inviting. And one other element about this, other than the leading lines, again, here comes the cursor, that are created by the window frame, is the fact that the reflection on the left is showing you curtains. The reflection on the right shows you something you actually can't see looking directly out the window. You can see another part of the view. If you had, for example, walked to the window and looked out and to your left, I think you would probably see what's shown here. And I think that's a really nice sort of a bonus, or an addition that one doesn't expect. And that unexpected, that element of surprise really helps to make the photograph even more interesting. So it's very, very well done. So let's talk a little bit about the rule of thirds. It's a phrase that we're all familiar with. We use a grid of 4 lines and divide the image into 9 equal squares. There's a lot behind this related to good design versus poor design, and I won't bore you with the details, but the rule of thirds and the placement of critical elements in a structure is seen all and throughout nature. And so when we show these kinds of things in a photograph, it resonates in our consciousness in ways that sometimes we're not even aware of. Important elements that fall in those intersections are said to conform to the rule of thirds. In most cases, it does make for a stronger image, and it helps drive the viewer's eye line, the point of focus, the balance, and the sense of energy and movement, and more. And if you look at this image, the first thing I want to talk about is the diagonals that are created by these ridge lines. There's 3.5. There's 1, 2. There's part of one here, and then of course the ridge line. And they're all pointing off the photograph. In other words, your eye would travel in our culture left to right, and they lead you off the photograph, except that this tree is perfectly placed on this point of the rule of thirds. So the eye would come in and perhaps come back to the tree and then circle back around to the other tree that's on the other point of the rule of thirds, or vice versa. Start here, circle up to here, and come back. And this kind of dynamism or creative tension that's put into a photograph really gives it longevity and staying power. It's not just a representation of the scene, it's the artist's choice. What's being shown is also intended to create an experience for you rather than just show you what was there. And I think that that's a very, very important part of composition. David?
Yeah, it's funny because I shot this image as kind of a throwaway shot. I scanned numerous images from the landscape at this point, and I never did anything with this image when I was looking through these as full resolution, full color National Geographic type images. It was only when I went back picking out images for this series of through the lens darkly shots that this one came up. Now, most of the shots in that series have a central focal point, because when you soften the focus and do other things to the perimeter to give it that kind of antique bad lens look, typically you need something in the middle to have that work. And so what amused me about adding this image to the series is there is nothing in the center. It's actually about 2 objects that are off-center, and yet you can make it a central composition of sorts. The foreground is softer, the background is softer, but it took David's eye to realize that what I had managed to do with this image was based on the rule of thirds, which is a rule I never, ever, ever consider when I'm shooting. I only consider it when I'm looking for ways to bail the boat when I'm analyzing images after the fact. It may be built into the way my eye works, but it's certainly not built into the way my brain thinks while I'm shooting.
Now, the use of movement. It can be part of a primary subject or an enhancement. The use of movement, I've got another example after this one, which is a classic. I included this one because I'm fascinated by the ocean, and how the ocean can show you stillness and movement all in one moment. The wave is apparently still or moving very slowly in the foreground, and yet here the speed accelerates to an incredible rate as it pitches out and rolls across from my point of view. And so this was about a 12-foot wave. It was taken in Northern California. But this is one of those images that to me is a lifetime favorite and really incorporates a lot in terms of movement, also in the use, not in the use, but in the color that was in the scene. You have the darker elements in the foreground and the lighter elements in the mid and background, which is in some people's view a little bit backwards, but it really works in this one to bring your eye from the lower right and up and over with the wave. So it's just one of my favorites. Go ahead, David.
To me, waves have a fractal nature, and it's sometimes difficulty scaling them. David tells me these waves are like 12 feet high, and I really couldn't guess whether they're 6 feet high or 12 feet high. I've noticed over the last decade that with the improvements of cameras, particularly waterproof cameras, that you're seeing more and more surfing photos that have lovely wave images like this in them, plus somebody on a surfboard. And there's several things about that worth noting. One is it gives human scale. Another is it adds another dimension of drama. There's somebody down there actually dealing with this wave. And it gives other factors to this that you don't necessarily think of just through the contrasts that it creates. It's an opaque object and a solid object in what's otherwise a liquid field. So it creates that figure ground effect that wave images sometimes miss. When you're shooting wave images as wave images, you have to find something very special, like this one where you have this wind-blown lip where you get this just little bit of rising mist and the rainbow that forms in it. That's what makes this image special. And so that's the kind of thing you have to search for in a field image, be it a field of flowers or in this case a field of water. So David did a nice job, first off, getting this photo and living to tell the tale, but also in finding out of who knows how many photos he shot that day, the one that tells this story, which is more evocative than the typical wave image.
I see, before I move on, I see a couple of questions on the list. Where was I standing when I took this? I was standing on the San Simeon Pier, and the waves were running actually quite a bit bigger than this. It was an interesting experience. The pier was shaking enough that it caused me a lot of concern. It was really taking a pounding that week. But anyway, I'm well above the water, although there were some waves that on the big sets that actually touched the bottom of the pier further away from shore. Now this is a classic image. David, do you want to take this one?
Make sure my mic's on before I start. This is a classic image, and every time I see this image, it reminds me of the Cirque du Soleil because there are so many cultural elements that the Cirque has managed to bring in. They have in one of their shows, they have a clown on fire that is virtually this man in the foreground. It's that same aspect and silhouette, and there's this thing we call, when we stop talking about composition in a photo, we call gesture. And this is not a great photograph. It's got lots of random little pieces of stuff in it. And yet it is a famous photograph, and I would propose that it has as much as anything to do with gesture. The fact that it was caught at that split second where this man had made a decision and he's leaping and he's going to get his foot wet, but it hasn't happened yet, and the water is unbroken and the shadow is still perfect. So this is split-second timing and human gesture as much as it is kind of general rules of light and dark and compositional form.
One of the things that really appeals to me about this image is the reflection in the water and the opposites of shapes. And of course the gesture is the key to the success of the image. But one of the things that I like very much about this is the intersecting diagonals of the legs and of course the body being upside down. I think that really helps. I think if the water, it was a windy day and the water had ripples or whatever, and you didn't have that balancing element in the photograph, it wouldn't be as strong an image. But this is one of my all-time favorites. Framing. How you frame your shot. This is by Stieglitz, so it's quite an old photograph. But there's some very interesting things going on here. First of all, overall, how the image is framed, it gives you I think, an intimate view of the two subjects without crowding them. So it shows them in context, and the image is framed by the curb across the street and the woodpile in the foreground, and so it keeps the eye, and it's also framed in part by the part of the cart that's sticking up behind the horse. I forget what this is called. In any event, that frames this portion of the photograph, and then of course there's the interaction, the gesture between the horse and the person, and that hits just about perfectly on the rule of thirds node that exists at that spot in the image. And so it's a very intimate image, partly because of the framing, partly because of the use of thirds. But again, this is also one of my all-time favorites. David?
Well, the first thing I'm going to point out about this image is not compositional so much as color related. This is a gorgeous, almost too sepia image, and it would not be nearly as alive were it not in this tone. Sepias are like skin tones, and they're rich, and you can eat them with a spoon, and so that's part of what makes this image lovely to me. I mean, I agree with all the compositional issues. I agree with all the human interest issues, the fact that this is a conversation between a man and a horse, the little details about, you know, old-fashioned tack and wagons and things that make it clear how old this image really is are lovely. The fact that the firewood is crookedy firewood from, you know, some gnarled little set of trees rather than being the kind of straight stuff you get from some big virgin forest all puts this in context with the texture of the cobblestones, the texture of that firewood. It all adds to the image overall, as does the grain from the original image grain. All those things that we emulate these days are here for real in this image, and it makes it feel very authentic.
Now, in terms of exploring composition, I thought it would be helpful to sort of take a page out of the playbook that's used in print competition. And I didn't include everything, but I did include several elements here that I thought would be important to our discussion. And there are things to think about when you're creating an image, perhaps not just for yourself, but for a client or for sale or for exhibition. The four things are impact, style, creativity, and technique. And impact, does it have that wow factor? Is the message understood immediately? If it needs, in my view, if it needs explanation, that weakens the image. Style, does the image seem to be an extension of the sensibilities of the photographer? Generally speaking, images that I see that are like that will hold up over time, that they strike an emotional chord with the viewer because they did originally with the photographer. And the classic example is Ansel Adams' love for the outdoors and the mountains and the environment comes through in every photograph that you see that he's taken as a landscape. And those images hold up. They're almost immortal. Creativity was the image taken with creative intent, or made with creative intent. That old saying, you don't take a photograph, you make one. Does it show the creative intent? Is it innovative or unusual? I don't necessarily require that. I think that if it speaks to me, it doesn't necessarily have to be different than everybody else's photograph. But in a lot of cases, people do want to see that innovation and uniqueness. And technique, Was the image created with any use of any camera techniques or treatments or Photoshop so-called tricks? And does that technique support the image or does it distract? There are times, and I think we've all had this experience. I'm going to get a sip of water. Please wait one moment. Well, we've seen a color image that was just too saturated or a black and white that was just so contrasty that it was losing a lot of detail. And sometimes the technique sort of obliterates the creative intent of the maker, and that's something that's typically that you want to avoid. David, you want to take this one?
This may look like it is from France. It's actually from the coast of Maine, and it's a gatekeeper's house at Acadia National Park. And sometimes what's interesting about composition is what you chose not to shoot or what you chose not to use. I took many photos of this house, and this composition was the strongest image. It was also the closest shot I took. It's getting into that zone that we think of as macros and details. I am an architect, and I have an entire portfolio of nothing except architectural detail shots that I would be quite happy, using as a presentation unto themselves. I'm not sure the rest of the world is quite so entranced with architectural detail shots as I am, so I've never actually tried to mount a show of them. But an image like this says so much in terms of the wood and the brick and the stone and the like. And of course, there's no human element here other than the human sense of scale and who made this. But there's a life element in it, in that these Virginia creepers that are turning red in this image are very much tell you, they're very much alive, and it's very much a certain time of year. The leaves won't be on them much longer. So there is a real sense of those things that life adds. Architectural shots from the city where it's all stone can sometimes seem lifeless, as if they'd be the same any day of the year. Here you have life added to the shot, not through people or trees, but through this vine, which tells you exactly, if you know where it was shot, you know exactly which week of the year even it was shot by their changing color. So there are all those aspects of this, in addition to the kind of the classical compositional elements, which I'm going to toss right back at David Saffir.
Oh, wow. There's a couple of things here that I wanted to talk about just real briefly. One of them is if you look at the roof line, the shingles make sort of an upside down L shape, and then that's mirrored down below by the shape of the window frame and the brickwork down below it. So you have two L's nesting together, one much more organic and one much more architectural. And I like that dynamic of balancing shapes. The other thing that I like, although there is no human presence, the left-hand window is slightly open. And to me, that adds a little bit of element of mystery, who was there, who left it partway open. And I like that sort of thing. It would be a whole different feeling if that window were shut, in my opinion. So I like that little touch of the human presence in this image.
Very good. So here we have some more leaves turning red, and instead of having a very European feel, to me this one has a very Japanese feel. Perhaps it's because I know this is Japanese maple, but there's an Asian influence in art and photography that's gone on for centuries. Much of what the Impressionists studied were Japanese block prints, and they were working with the relationship between the two-dimensional and the three-dimensional in a very intent way there that had not necessarily occurred in previous art. So when I look at this image, I'm seeing something that I can recognize it from Japanese ink drawings and things I've seen, Asian images of my own time, but I also recognize that even the European art that I grew up on had a great influence from Asian sources. So this is multi-generational references in this. And then you can throw those all away and say, I don't know what tree this is, maybe it's marijuana, and what is this just in terms of the pure graphics. mean, there is this arch to the branch and the delicate leaves on that arch of the branch that makes this form, this gesture in the foreground. And then there's the greenery in the background, which does not come into clear focus, that makes this a much more satisfying image. If the depth of field had been greater here, then the focus on that gesture in the foreground would have been lost.
I think David pretty much said it all. I would just add one thing, which is that it's obviously been raining, and one of the things that I like about this photograph is the delicacy of the leaves and the detail that's available to the viewer, and then the little drops of water are just that last finishing touch that that really draws the viewer in, and that's part of this image that I really like. Okay, moving along. This image was taken in the Eastern Sierra. Interesting background to this that I'll get to in a moment, but this is one of those images that's really quite unconventional. It's very complex. It's an unusual subject. I don't think I've seen very many photographs that look like this. The tree roots are exposed in part because the water was higher at one point and eroded the bank, and now it's lower. And I like the way that they're all pointing down. If you look at the angles, they're all pointing down. And in a way, they seem to be pointing down to this cave, which almost looks like a mouth and a face. And so you've got the upper part of this image that's got some pretty spooky aspects to it. And then we have the lower part of the image, which is almost surreal. If you look at them, it's a longer exposure, so the movement in the water, the softness of the surface of the water, and they're framed by the boulder and the log. And then you have this wonderful branch that's pointing almost like a finger down into the water and downstream and draws your eye down. So it's really quite a complex image. There's a lot going on, but it's also, to me, very appealing. It's very much a reflection of what that area was like at that point in time. David.
The colors in this are, since David's such a great classical composition person, I keep finding myself playing all the alternate elements here, color being the most obvious here. If you took this and you thought it was rendered by you know, a major artist, you know, Andrew Wyeth or someone of that nature, and that he'd done it as a sepia, then you could look at this image and say, okay, it's got this nearly black and white nature to it. Oh, and then look how cleverly the artist put that little touch of green at the top and a little touch at the side, and then brought your eye down to the yellow in the leaves on the rock, and back around to the lower saturation hue of the mossy tones. And while as a photographer you don't get to actually paint those things in, you do get to compose them in. And we too often don't think of controlled palette as something that's part of photography, and it very, very much is. And sometimes it's through selection, sometimes it's through Photoshop work, sometimes it's simply through composition. And I think that the color aspects of this photo, the large areas that are almost neutral and the other areas that are warmer into moss tones and into brilliant leaf tones, make this image much more powerful. A black and white of this image would be all about root detail and water motion, and as it stands, there's this whole other dimension of colors that would be lost in a black and white image.
Now, while you were speaking, I saw one question come through, which was, what were the camera settings for this shot? And if memory serves, I'm using a medium format camera. It was either f/18 or f/22, and probably close to a second exposure at ISO 50. So if that helps, I hope that helps. David, this is one of yours.
Yeah, actually, I shot this just the other day. I named it jokingly My Tuscany, since one of my closest friends had just sent me a photo of the real Tuscany, which is brilliantly green with winter wheat, and it was 70 degrees there the day that I shot this photo. This does have a Tuscan look with the round hay bales and the rolling hills, and occasionally it will snow in Tuscany. This would be a record amount for them to have, and I actually had to shoot this quick before we got more here in Maine, which would have just made this image far less interesting to have it be virtually nothing but a snowbank. So looking at this, since I've let David do all the compositional heavy lifting to date, let me take a little and say this image has a certain form of symmetry. It has been cropped so that the hill in the back and the rise of the hills in the foreground form a symmetrical form. However, stamped, almost tattooed on top of that symmetry are the hay bales, and the rhythm and the pattern of those hay bales is very, very important. The closest one is to the far right, so there's this big boom, and then there's a medium-sized boom just off center as your eye moves across, and then way to the right there's a smaller boom with the hay bale with the incredible texture as the sun is running across it. And then you go back into the little staccato ta-ta-ta-ta of the hay bales across the bottom of the hill and across the top of it. So there's an eye pattern movement here that is controlled by the hay bales and by the land forms that they're on. So having discussed that, I'm going to turn the tables and tell David that I've been talking about the color on all his compositional images. Why don't you talk about the color on my compositional image?
Okay. There's an interesting thing going on here, actually, which is that, you know, we talked before about how warmer colors come forward, but the warmer colors in this are in the midground. Midground and the background. So they're behind the cooler foreground, which is really reflecting the sky on snow. And I think that gives this a sense of being able to, a feeling of being able to almost reach out into the image and access the parts of the image that are distant from the viewer. And it sort of shortens the feeling of the length of the field in a way for me. And I like that. I like having that spotlight in the distance, if you will, and the colors, they are really complex, by the way. It's not just warm. There's several colors working there. And the line of the hay bales gives it some additional features and texture. And it also happens to be triangular in shape, which is echoing the triangular shapes in the foreground. But the use of color here is actually quite dramatic, really does make the photograph. I'm sure you didn't have a whole lot of time to shoot this. It was probably a fleeting moment, but that fleeting moment really comes through in the image, and it's one of the winners. It's really nice.
It definitely was fleeting, and I was well aware of that as I shot it. A couple that I shot a second later didn't work. But there's also a cultural history here in that the Impressionists were the ones that taught us about, you know, the pinkness of light and the blueness of shadows, and even the purpleness of that. And Manet's hay bales or hay mounds were one of the things that any of you who went to art school and studied art history, you probably spent a great deal of time staring at those purple shadows on those hay mounds with those pink highlights and saying, is that real, or was he really just kind of playing with us? Well, here you see it in a photograph, and I've not even enhanced it here. Some of the other photos from this series, I have cranked up the saturation a bit, but in this one, this really is the blue that you saw when you looked into that shadowy valley, and that really is the pink of the low light on those hay bales, and it very much confirms exactly what Manet was seeing for the first time with his artistic eye in the 1800s, in which anybody who's studied art history since then has learned from him. We all learn from the masters as we move along, and so I'm as likely to treat a hayfield based on Andrew Wyeth's paintings or treat a hay bale based on Monet's paintings than I am on some other photographer, because it's all art after all.
Now, before I move on with the discussion, it's 12:55. We've got several slides to go. I want to point out that we're definitely going to run overtime. I'm not going to shortchange the discussions. I try to abbreviate them slightly. So I'm just letting the audience know that we will probably run over 10 minutes or so. David, do you want to start with this one also?
Sure. This one is the image that I was saying had a very similar composition to the couple with their arms around each other at the beginning of the set. if you were to take these two and put them side by side, aside from the fact that this one has now been sepified in Nick's Snapseed software and had a few effects placed on it, and the other one is much more photographically literal, the composition of the two is very similar. I mean, they're successful because they are a tunnel of light in a dark space, which is not an unusual photographic technique, but they differ in other ways. I mean, this is not about lovers. This is about leaves and chairs, and yet oftentimes these things are stand-ins for human beings. They give you a sense of human scale. When we were talking earlier about this image, David Saffir made a brilliant comment about the fact that the pairs of chairs have a relationship, that the fact that the chairs are together is almost as though there were people there. There's a sense of camaraderie and intimacy and various other things in this image that all come just from the furniture. So that is kind of an intriguing idea. And of course, there's the old photographic joke of add water, make any photograph more interesting. If I had shot this 10 minutes earlier before it started raining, it would not have had several of the interesting reflective and other effects that it has here. And of course, the processing through Snapseed to get the blur at the edges and the various other effects here make it kind of delicious. But if it was not a good composition, then all that would just be window dressing. You can make a pretty picture out of anything with the appropriate set of filters. Whether it makes it a good composition or an image you will remember is separate from how tasty the brown color in the image is.
I just want to point out a couple of things about the composition. If you look at the overarching trees, again, we have like a mass of shadow here, which is counterbalanced by a lighter area sort of in the middle, and the shape of the table and the chairs on the lower right. And so we have this tension between these two elements that works really quite nicely. And then going straight across them is this band of light that also happens to intersect with the line of the wall coming down here. So there's some really nice compositional elements in here that work together to create a sense of place, and also to direct the viewer where the photographer wants them to look. I've included this image. This is one of David's images. I included this image just for a couple of reasons. First of all, simply because of the contrast of these really strong structural elements against an almost surreal, bank of clouds and blue sky behind them. And so you have this contrast, foreground and background. I think the lighting creates a really nice dynamic in light and shadow here, as do the shapes of the timbers as they're put together. The fact that it's just a frame instead of a completed structure, I think, also adds to the appeal of the image. David?
Yeah, I've never done anything with this image. I think the first thing I would do would be perhaps to straighten it, that is to make the vertical components on that cupola truly vertical. The day I shot this, I might have taken 50 or 100 images of this freshly built timber frame, which was up there basically for advertising purposes, and so I had free rein to walk around it. And if there were full shots of it, there were shots in full sun, shots like this where it's slightly shaded, shots that were very, very close-up details of timber detailing. This one struck me as the strongest image overall, and part of the reason for that is it's not in bright sun, so you're not dealing with high contrast on the frame, which makes the entire frame dark against the lighter background, giving you a very powerful silhouette effect. This is hemlock, which is a kind of a tanner wood than most. It is much more close to the color of human skin than many woods, which makes this, again, the same thing I've been saying about sepias that you could eat with a spoon. We relate to skin tones very strongly. So this skin tone in this wood is something that we relate to more than if it were made out of red oak or some other wood, perhaps. And then there are these very clinical things like the arch of the cloud being powerful, and the cools in the background and the warms in the foreground, and all of those classical things that make a photograph work are here. However, they could all be here and have this photo not work. You have to have the geometry plus all those other aspects, plus just some human interest. Timber frames are one of these things that humans relate to. This is probably how we built houses for a very long time before we built them the way we do today, so this really beckons to us on an emotional level. Wow, speaking of beckoning to us on an emotional level, this photo certainly does that.
Go for it.
Well, if you think of the religious significance of a small bit of light in a large dark place, I mean, Corbusier built an entire church based on that principle. And that's what's happening here. And this is in a church, or a wing to a church system. This would actually have been a monastery or the like. So each of the rooms on the sides is a little tiny monk's cell. But you don't really need to know that in order to appreciate the painterly nature of the light bouncing off the plaster on the top and the tiles on the bottom, and just the way this all comes together as an incredibly powerful composition. Well, it has everything going for it. It's one-point perspective, and the brightest and highest contrast is exactly at the point where those perspectives merge, so you can hardly miss. This is shooting fish in a barrel in that sense. It is interesting to think of it in other senses. This is a free handheld shot with probably a Canon 5D or 5D Mark II. Don't remember which year this was shot. But what we're looking at here is what your eye sees in this space. Now, if I'd gotten out a tripod and had taken a 30-second exposure here, every single bit of the mystery could be removed from this image by having no darkness left in it. And there's a real tendency, if you were to shoot, and I worked in Tuscany last summer with a photographer who would often take 8 or 10 different exposures in series of a dark place like this. And then when he sandwiched them all back together, my iPhone shot probably had more mystery in it than his, sandwiched image. They're images for a very different purpose. This is to me what I wanted from this image. If I cranked the shadow slider down in Lightroom when I was processing this, it was with intent, wanting there to be a ring of darkness around the entire edge of this image.
I can't think of a thing to add.
It's seldom I can leave you speechless, David.
Yeah, so. Now, I just want to say that this is an impromptu shot. It deliberately breaks just about every rule in the book, and it still works marvelously well. And there's a story behind this, which I'll touch on, and then I'll hand this back to David because it's his photograph. What I like is that what's incorporated in this photograph, there's something incorporated in this photograph which is not actually in view of the camera, it's a reflection. I love reflections. What we're seeing is an awning or an umbrella over a table. I guess it's a sidewalk restaurant. And at first glance, a lot of people look at this and go, what the heck is that and what's going on? And with a little bit of studying or an explanation, they realize what it is. But I think it's a really unique view, and also brings back the lesson to us that sometimes the best pictures around are the ones that are right under our nose. David?
Yeah, it's worth mentioning here that there are photos, perhaps the last photo is something that I might print 5 feet high and put on my wall and enjoy it year after year. You might be able to learn something new from it every time you look at it. So think of a photo as the photo that one person might look at 1,000,000 times. That's an art photo. How about the photo that 1,000,000 people might look at once? That's what you ought to be putting in a magazine or a newspaper or a web release of some kind. This is what this image is. This is a throwaway image. It's like a joke. Once you've figured out the puzzle, you're done. You don't necessarily need to look at the image again. Now, it's got this big gob of gorgeous color in the middle of it, so that makes it a very compelling image on another level, but it's really okay for an image to not be immediately understandable. We're talking about a 2D representation of a 3D thing, and there are all sorts of other limitations in dynamic range and whatnot, and binocular vision that are all missing in a 2D image. So we're all accustomed to decoding them. And if they're more difficult to decode because they're a macro or some, squirrely little image of undecipherable things, that makes them into puzzles. And those puzzles are very useful if you figure out where to use them. And the best place to use them is where you want to capture people's attention. And, instead of using, sex as the only thing that can grab anybody's attention on the page, here's another alternative. How about a spoon full of, colors? That's just a great attention grabber for, whatever purpose. I would put this in a review of a casual restaurant for sure as a great image to capture people's attention.
Now this is a still life, of course, and it's side lit, which is one of my favorites, maybe just a little bit off on an angle. And I'll just talk a little bit about some of the elements here. The strongest element in this is probably the yellow flower on the right, and it's the anchor for the composition. And if you look at this, everything else, and of course it describes a circle, everything else in this photograph is arranged in a series of circles around this flower. So you see the 3 flowers on the left, and then you have the mortar and pestle and the apple and the handle of the cup on the left. There's arcs all through this image that all sort of converge on this yellow flower. And I think that's one of the really appealing things about this image, in addition to the lighting. David?
And my first thought when I saw this photo is I would Photoshop the little bit of text that you can't quite read and that doesn't quite go with it out of the porcelain on the lower left, just because you don't need anything in there that's distracting you, that's not part of the composition. If there was more of it and it related more to the reds and the flowers, then in that case I'd leave it. But what I'm looking at here is an image in kind of 2 phases. There are light, bright, colorful things in the form of the bouquet, the cup, and the apple, and there are dark, rich, textured things in the background, the texture of the table and that mortar and pestle in the background. So that works for me very well in that sense. This is a still life lit in the classical sense of many still lives, and yet it is very much not a classical still life. A classical still life might include these same elements, but it wouldn't do this macro, tight, cropped at an angle thing that this does, that we're so comfortable with today, but which really didn't exist for 100 years ago. A sketch wouldn't even have been done in this manner. It all would have been of some larger whole than this. So the fact that the little tips of the leaves of the flower petals to the right have been clipped off, which is thought of as a big no-no in photography, doesn't bother me a bit. This entire thing is close cropped, and that just kind of adds to the tension of the close crop. So it works very well for me as kind of what I would call a modern macro.
There's a question on the board about lighting, pardon me, and of course I'm guessing, but my take on this is that this is a window light. It's coming from camera left and probably at a slight angle of a few degrees. It's probably taken right near a kitchen window or another window in a home or a studio. So there's nothing particularly complicated about it, and of course you would 99 times out of 100 want to shoot this off with the camera mounted on a tripod so that you could frame it up exactly the way you wanted it, and use a smaller aperture for depth of field, and it would be a pretty long exposure probably.
Have to add a comment on that, which is that these types of casual macro shots are my justification for not using a tripod, and David just succeeded in making his justification for using one. That's what makes this field interesting.
Yeah.
So on to this next composition. This one is put in here because we haven't really done much on symmetry, and we all know the symmetry of you're shooting a cathedral and the left half exactly matches the right half, and if you don't get the model to stand exactly in the middle of the apse or the aisle and part her hair in the middle, and if you don't get exactly in line with her, you're going to pay the price for that and having that symmetry be broken. Just a little, just enough so it's annoying. So here's an image that does exactly that. It's a symmetrical image. No one's going to disagree with that. You've got the two men in similar outfits facing each other in a very mirrored pose. The the lighting and the what that is probably part of the ventilation system overhead there, that all lines up very symmetrically into the image. And yet, the table's not straight on. There's the strength of that horizontally striped cooling rack on one side that's not on the other. To try to make this a truly and perfectly symmetrical image would probably fail. And in fact, if I had taken one from a foot further to the side so the table was straight on, the composition of other components, like their alignment in front of that element at the top, probably wouldn't have worked. So symmetry often means a reference to symmetry by balancing various components rather than meaning, the most literal of symmetries. I didn't crop extra off the right end to make the placement of the two men identical because it would have cut into that rack, and I didn't think that was necessarily the best choice. So there would probably be a dozen ways of treating this image, all of which could be legitimate. The one I chose was to focus on the center by softening the edges, and to focus on them and their task through the focus without being too literal on the symmetry of the image.
I'll just make one quick comment, is that for the most part this image is monochrome. It's really doesn't have a lot of color in it, except for the faces of the two men working at the table, and I think that draws attention to them, and it's one of the elements of the photograph that I particularly like. Now this is a picture of a bowl from Sweden, and we're talking about symmetry, and I was shooting this for publication, and I was trying to figure out a way to show this bowl and show it somehow in a way that was new but still recognizable for what it was. And I thought symmetry, obviously, concentric circles, and then the reflection in the bottom, it's shot on top of a piece of plexiglass with a light underneath and then a light backlighting it. And that worked quite well, but I just liked the convergence of shapes in this and the overall symmetry, and I thought I would put this in as another example. David?
Yeah, I've got to agree that looking at this bowl, how would one shoot it? How would one get the most dynamic image? This is what we call rotationally symmetrical. If you stand exactly above it, there's 1/16 of your image would get the entire amount of information because you could just replicate it rotationally and the whole thing would be there. So breaking that axis and even violating the object by cutting one edge off, because we know what's on that edge, it's the same as the rest of it, creates a tension, creates a figure-ground relationship where now the blue of the background and the blue of the inside of the bowl can kind of leak into one another from where you've cut the dark blue edge. So you're making a figure here that, if you squint your eyes at this, you see a brandy snifter with the base on it and the outline with, oh, let's see, there must be an olive in it. So this has created a whole secondary level of forms out of what could be a very static image. So that whether the creator of this bowl would think this was the best shot of it is one question. Whether people would find this to be a more dynamic and interesting image of the object is a separate question. Sometimes you have to put up with what the person paying you is willing to pay for, but you always try to put the artistic images in front of them in hopes that they'll get it and they'll choose those.
Great comment, thank you. So exploring composition, at the end of the day, you have to think in some respects about output. Where are you going with this? Where do you want to land? What does success look like? And some pointers for you: do calibrate your display. Even in the world of black and white, it helps protect your highlight and shadow detail and gives you better mid-tone gradations. And so there's no excuse. The technology has gotten to be incredibly good, incredibly accurate, and if you're not calibrating your display once a month, I encourage you to do so. Select your output media carefully. Some media selections will clip colors or compress your dynamic range. And the classic example, of course, is a glossy print media versus a matte print media. Glossy will show more detail, be more contrasty, have more saturated colors. The art paper will be softer and more painterly, have some loss of dynamic range, etc., etc. So those are just two examples. There's thousands and thousands of choices out there, and of course the way you make the print also affects these elements. If you do outsource, work with a good printmaker and someone who's experienced, who can understand your vision and your intended goals. You know, I'm a printmaker. Of course, digital silver imaging, one of the things that I particularly appreciate about Eric Luden and his staff is that they do this. They really work to understand where the destination is and what the intended goals are, and they really try to help realize the vision. And I think someone who can't do that as a printmaker, that's the best reason to fire them and find somebody else. And if you find a printmaker that can do that for you, hang on to them. Well, I want to say thank you to Datacolor and Digital Silver Imaging. There's some special promos. We've also got a winner for the Spyder Pro, which I'm waiting for a name, Liz Lopez. And you'll be getting an email notification asking you for mailing information and that sort of thing. We're also offering 20% off all Spyder products at datacolor.com. It's valid from today through the 22nd, and the promo code is composition20. Digital Silver Imaging has a promo, save $20 on a 20 by 30 true black and white photographic RC or archival color inkjet print. It includes shipping. You can upload it through their online service, and there's a URL here. And please keep in mind that you will get an email later today with all these details, so don't drive yourself nuts trying to write all this stuff down. The promo code for Digital Silver Imaging is Spyder 2013, and it's valid through January 31st. And again, this will all be coming to you on an email. Again, my name is David Saffir. David Saffir Photography. I would point you for instructional material and things like that to my blog, which is davidsaffir.wordpress.com. I need to do some work on my website, but there are some images at davidsaffir.com, www.davidsaffir.com, and of course David Tobie has an excellent blog on a wide variety of subjects at cdtobie.wordpress.com. And his web address is cdtobie.com. I want to thank everybody for attending. I encourage you to watch the Datacolor website and your email for upcoming events. We have just about finished the schedule for the first half of 2013. We're going to be publishing that soon. So keep coming back. We'll try to keep you challenged and interested and informed. Thanks very much.
And thank you for joining us, David.